So, welcome everyone. Welcome Eddie to the Hard Hat Talks podcast. It's a bit of a mouthful when you try to say that too fast, actually. This is our first podcast with a guest. So, welcome and thank you for doing it. I was looking back my diary, my calendar, to think when we first met, and it was actually January 2024 where I popped up to see you up in Dundee.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yep. And I'd been following you on LinkedIn. I noticed that you're very vocal, which I quite like on LinkedIn, about some of the challenges that you've faced over the years. And when I came up, we had a good conversation and probably tried to fix too many things that we probably can't fix in the first place anyway. So I was intrigued for my first podcast to get someone on who has a bit of tenure in industry, and we've got some synergies as well in terms of what you've done and what I've done. So just to start off then, could you tell us a wee bit how you got started in the industry?
Yeah, absolutely. I started as soon as I left school. All I ever wanted to be was a joiner as I was going through school. I loved building, creating things. I was big into Lego and model making and the like, and drawing up on A0-size drawing boards, designing buildings and houses and whatnot as a teenager. But my father had a small joinery business, and the ambition for me was to leave school and become a joiner, just like my dad. Much to their disappointment, because my parents wanted me to go on and be an architect, because it was something that, in effect, I did as a hobby and for fun. My teachers, the rector at school, the techie department at school, everyone all wanted me to go on and be an architect, but I didn't. I wanted to build things. I wanted to be able to create things. So left school at almost 17. I was by the time I managed to convince my parents that higher education wasn't the route I wanted to go down, and started working with my father and served my time as a joiner.
Okay.
So yeah, 16, which was many years ago now. So I've been in the industry for a long time. But even prior to leaving school, and weekends, holidays, etc., if there was the opportunity to go and do some work with my father, even at that young age, then I would go out and spend my Saturdays or Sundays and help out on some of the small joinery projects that he was working on at the time.
That's interesting. So I suppose from a young age then you were always exposed to construction, but also exposed to business.
Yeah, absolutely. My father set up his business back in, I think it was 1984, there or thereabouts, when he set up his joinery company. And he had a really good little business. At one point in time, we were fitting out large schools. We were doing interior fit out works for companies like Bank of Scotland, RBS, the Standard Life, doing quite high end office interiors, and lots of commercial interior fit out type work. And I think probably by the early 2000s, there was probably, as part of 50 plus people are working for Dad. But Dad's passion was joinery as well. I don't think, fortunately Dad's no longer here, but I don't think he really enjoyed the business part of running the business, but he absolutely loved working as a joiner and working with people. So I think that's probably where my mix of both kind of came.
Right.
But certainly in the early years, by the time I was in my late teens, I was helping with admin of the business as well as working out on site, and that's probably now why I continue even to this day, where my day job is being out on site and trying to herd the craziness that goes on there, and probably my homework job is more the admin and catching up on all the business side of what's to be done, and then obviously a blend of that
stuff we've got to do when you're running and leading a business, isn't it?
So
it's interesting because when I was young as well, I'd always got an aspiration to have a business. I don't actually know where that came from. My dad, when I was younger, worked in a local factory, kept racing pigeons, but I was right into racing pigeons.
So did my father.
There we go. Something in common. but I think it was that structure that he brought to me as a young, 12-year-old, structure with the pigeons. They had to get fed at a certain time, watered at a certain
That's
time,
right, yeah.
let in, let out, all that kind of stuff. That structure, that organisation, I think is the thing that led me to think I want to have a business, albeit when I was young, I didn't know exactly what. And like you, when I was 12, when I was really young, I did want to be an architect, but I never ever wanted to be a joiner. I wanted to be an architect, but it's funny how for some people at an early age, these things kick in,
So before setting up your own business, did you always wheel and deal doing little things here and there to try and earn some extra pocket money? And
well, we would have called them homers back in the day,
Yeah,
So as a young architecture student, I would do the odd homer, usually for family or friends, Always paid the tax and the VAT on it, of course,
Of course, yes.
But it was really, it was pocket money, it was money to go on holiday with and what have you. And I feel sorry for the architects or the youngsters nowadays have got to have PI insurance regardless of whether they're qualified or not, And the level of information that you've got to put in drawings nowadays to get a homer through planning and building control vastly outweighs what we had to do back then.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's different.
I think when even before leaving school, as I said, I've had the opportunity to go and work a few hours with Dad and earn a little bit of extra pocket money, because my sister and I always got our weekly pocket money. But Mum and Dad were of the ilk that if we wanted something that we couldn't really afford, they would say, well, save up your pocket money, and once you've saved up half, for example, if you wanted to buy a fancy train for your train set, and they would say, well, if you save up half, we'll contribute the other half. Yeah. So that kind of gave that, I suppose, boost to go out and do a little bit more. And from early teens, I would be making paperweights in my bedroom and have my friends go out and knock on doors and try and sell them. Right. And there was a couple who used to make what we would call tablet and macaroon bars. It was all the different chocolate bars that they would sell around the doors. And I remember them asking if I was interested in trying to sell some of those. And if you sold a full box of these bars, which I think there was 40 or 50 bars in a box, you got £3 for selling them. So to start with, I would go out and be doing it myself, and maybe sell 3 or 4 boxes worth over that week. And some of my friends then started to say, "Oh, you're earning all this extra money. Could we help?" And at that point in time, I'd said, "Well, yeah, absolutely. I get paid £2 a box. Well, obviously, I was getting paid £3. I get paid £2 a box for selling them. So if you sell some of the boxes, I'll go halfway and split the money." Right. So then I ended up with a network of all my friends who wanted extra money as well, who were going out and doing all the sales pitch, selling all the boxes of tablet and macaroon and chocolate bars, and I was giving them £1 a box. I was making £2 off theirs, and plus obviously what I was getting myself. Yeah. And by the time I mixed that in with the paperweights, I had a little job working on a local ice cream van and a little mobile shop, and I dabbled in newspapers. Didn't like doing the milk because that was really, really early starts, which wasn't for me. So the funny thing was when the likes of my big cousin, for example, who was a couple of years older than I was, when he left school, he went straight into the YTS scheme for the job training and learning about trades, etc. And I think he was getting paid something like £25 or £26 a week. And I was in third year at school, and still I was earning about £150 a week with all the little jobs that I was doing. So I think from a really young age, that's where my passion for getting involved in different businesses and doing different things and it was never really about money, because even now we still just give it all away. There's never anything left for me. Right. But I think even back then it was really just the satisfaction of being able to do something and achieve something, and if I found out that someone else was selling more boxes of the tablet and macaroon than I was able to sell them, I would go out and work extra hours just so that at the end of the week I knew that I would be the person who was selling the most.
You want to be the top kiddie?
Hated. I've always been competitive. So.
Well, it's good skill sets to learn at an early age, and these things certainly set us up for later on in life. tell us a wee bit about Invertay Homes then, and your journey with Invertay Homes from maybe conception to where you're at today.
So Invertay came about after probably a year and a half, 2 years of conversation with Mike, who's my business partner in Invertay Homes.
Yep.
So in the early years, as I said, all my background was large-scale commercial office interiors, fitting out schools, etc. And in the early 2000s, I then did a couple of training courses because I had this passion to move over into building housing, mainly because I wanted to build my own house. I'd been looking into timber frame homes, the way in which they were built, etc. And I thought, well, that's something I think I would like to go and do. So ended up doing some retraining and started building houses using SIPS panels, which was at that time something that was really new to the market in the UK. It was able to deliver a really good energy efficiency for the houses. It was a nice, efficient, fast way of building a house. And at that time, I thought that was something that could be the future of housing. And that was back in the early 2000s. And the customers that we were getting with the SIPS panels was big grand design type houses. So the first house I ever built, or we ever built, because I was still working with my father and whatnot at the time, was 630 square metre, an all singing, all dancing. It had underfloor heating upstairs and downstairs. It had a central vacuum system. It had Spanish porcelain tiles right through the ground floor. It had a glass balcony overlooking a big vaulted ceiling atrium, etc. So, back then, no one knew of grand design houses. There wasn't Kevin MacLeod on the TV promoting this. So that was the kind of thing we did for a few years, and we were lucky enough to have. That particular one ended up on the front page of one of the Sunday newspaper magazines, and so we did okay out of that. But if you watch Grand Designs, the average aspirational grand design person always goes way over budget. They always go way over time. They always change their mind 100 times as they're being or as the house is being created, which is perfectly fine. But obviously, as the builder, you're always still last in the queue to be paid. And we did have several occasions, quite a few actually, where people would get to a certain stage having asked for a wall to be moved over 300 millimeters and change this and change that, etc. And they would then realise, actually, we've no longer got the money to take the house to a complete finish, or we need to stop. And then once we've got some more money, we'll get you guys back. And of course, that stop-start isn't really commercially viable. It's not a way to you need to be able to take a project from start to finish to make it work. So when I met Mike, we were at that time doing quite a bit of traveling just for other things that we were involved in, and we were big into sort of adventure type things. We would go jumping out of airplanes and climb mountains and all kinds of fun things like that. So we would spend lots of time traveling to do some of these things. And the conversation always came round to housing. And Mike's from New Zealand, so he's not a native Scot, although he's well, I guess we can call him an honorary Scot now that he's been here for 15, 16, 17 years, however long it is. And he's married to a girl from Scotland. He has his children here now, and he's perfectly happy. Well, I'm assuming he's happy, but perfectly settled here. But Mike would always be talking about the houses over in New Zealand and how that compared to houses here, and how it was becoming extremely difficult for him and Elaine to find the type of house that they wanted with the space and for starting a family. And I was continually complaining how the mainstream, the big nationals were delivering houses that were becoming smaller and smaller as the years went by, that the quality wasn't very good, that no one was paying any attention to energy efficiency. And when we looked at what we had been doing in high-end office interiors, then transferring that into high-end house building, that to take all of that knowledge and those skills, I believed that mainstream house building would be easy. Forget the politics behind it, but the houses themselves, that to be able to deliver a good quality product at an affordable price and giving people more space wouldn't be a big challenge at all. So after about a year and a half or 2 years of us talking about it, I think one afternoon or one night we were sitting having a beer together, once again the conversation come round to housing, and once again, because we'd been having a couple of beers, where most decisions, silly decisions are made, like signing up for triathlons and things like that, was, on this occasion we decided that the only way to change the world was to join forces and go and do it ourselves, because no one else was going to listen.
Right.
So I completed the works that I was doing at that time. Mike was working as a project manager on, I want to say it was a big transmission project with, I think it was SSE. He was doing big infrastructure type projects at the time, and project managing those. So taking Mike's background and his skills and his abilities, my background and knowledge and abilities in house building, we just clamped those together and we set up, or decided we would set up the business. And after lots of to and froing and playing about with ideas, I think it was actually my wife Mandy who came up with the name Invertay Homes. So that went on quite a long list of different possible names, and we kept coming back to that, and eventually we stuck with Invertay, set the business up. We set the business up in 2013, June or July 2013, but it took us until September 2015 before we managed to put the first spade in the ground on our first development, which was for 30 houses.
Right.
So it was a reasonably decent sized development, straight out of the box.
So it does take time to get, never mind setting the company up, but just getting a job from, the first lines on a bit of paper to getting it on site can take a good couple of years. I think a lot of, you wouldn't consider yourself as a novice developer back then, because you've obviously had a lot of experience in the construction industry, but was that your first time taking a project from cradle to the ground up kind of thing? Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think most people probably follow the same journey as we did, and particularly myself, where you've been involved maybe in housing, maybe in doing retrofits or refurbishments, etc., and then decided maybe to build one house and tick along at that. But I think people fail to appreciate or understand the big step change to go from that to a much larger development, where it now involves things like road construction consents and road bonds, and and from an access to finance point of view, it's massively different. And I think, despite the fact that I knew how to build a house and everything, and that was one good thing about my background, was I had been involved in everything from digging trenches in the machines and pouring in the concrete, right through to being involved in the final snagging and every single element through that whole process. In my early years, whilst serving my time as a joiner, we would build all of the partitions, whether it was aluminium demountable partitions or whether it was timber frame. We would plasterboard them. We would have to do all of the Ames taping, and eventually we would get involved in decoration, etc. So it was good to get a very broad knowledge of every single element of how to build a house, but taking that over into a much bigger setup to deliver 30 houses was significantly different, and lots of learning, and even things we would do. We ran lots of scenarios. We came up with the designs for the house. We came up with the designs for the master plan, and once we put all that together, that would allow us to then look at running development appraisals, generating cash flows, etc. And I remember on that very first development that we got everything all set up. We got everything all in place, and broke ground on the site. And it wasn't until we were maybe 2 or 3 months into to the development when we were told that we needed to have a road bond for for building the road. And of course,
No,
we had no idea what a road bond was.
That's,
What's a road bond? We certainly hadn't budgeted for a road bond, and it was explained to us by the engineers. Oh, well, typically, the big house builders, what they do is they go to an insurance company or a bond provider. You give them all the details, and you'll get a bond value from the council, and you'll then get an insurance-backed bond to put in place for that. So of course we thought, oh, well, okay, it'd be like going and getting car insurance.
That's right,
we go out to the market, find a decent policy. No.
It's not easy when you're just doing the first one.
Well, especially after the whole financial crash of 2008 and how that impacted housing and how that changed the whole landscape around developments, etc. For a new business to go out and get a road bond is basically impossible. And the bond value, I mean, even to this day, we have conversations about bonds, and it's maybe something we can touch on, but I mean, the cost that we had for building out all of the roads on that development, using a good, reputable company, was coming in at about 170 to 180,000 pounds. The bond that we had to put in place for the local authorities was 455,000, and because we couldn't get a bond, we had to find 455,000 pounds to pay the bond. And as you can imagine, for two people who have already emptied the piggy banks, used all of our savings, we've set the credit cards on fire by using them that many times. All of the funding that we've managed to put in place, etc. There certainly wasn't an extra 400,000 pounds stuffed down the couch to pick up the difference. So that was a lot of plate spinning to make that work. But that was just one example of the kind of things that, as an inexperienced mainstream or larger developer, that we had no knowledge of, and it certainly creates a few headaches.
It's interesting because I've dabbled in development, not to the extent of you. I think I've built 60 odd houses in my career, out with the architecture stuff that we do. But my first site was 30 houses as well. But I seen it from a slightly different perspective, where I knew about the bonds and insurance, because that's what we deal with as architects all day long. So the planning process, the dealing with the conditions, make sure you get your conditions dealt with before you start a site. That was all like second nature to me, And then we started on site, and I'm turning up, and as much as architects know about construction, the whole sequencing and the phasing and dealing with the challenges on site, that was completely new to me. And I found myself going to bed at night, and the site agent would say something daft like, I'm waiting on these, this truckload of block coming tomorrow morning to get that foundation out. I go, okay. And I'd be up all night worrying. I wonder if that block's coming tomorrow. And it wasn't and the team that we had put together, that wasn't my job or my responsibility. But I think that's the thing I'm trying to get to is that, despite the fact that, and we see a lot of developers in the business who come in with a certain degree of experience, but it's never really all-rounded. It's not until you get into maybe your second or third development, you've got a good idea of actually what you've been through, but what's coming ahead.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that I think, and I'm a great believer that people should go out and get educated, and get the right education, even if that's if they've got to pay for it, then that's fine. But it's that, even with the education, until you went through the process a couple of times.
Absolutely, and I think obviously you talked about LinkedIn earlier, and I am quite vocal about lots of different things, and none of it's in a disrespectful way, but I think that, having gone through that scenario where you've been involved in the actual construction of houses, that, in my opinion, would then make you a far better architect, because it's not just about designing the houses, but understanding the process of taking that from a design all the way through to a completed product. And I think the difficulty we have in our industry is that the average brickie has no real appreciation of the life that an architect or an engineer, or we'll call it the industry professionals, that they lead. And the exact is the same the opposite way, where the average architect probably doesn't really appreciate the way in which your average brickie works. And it's all very well coming up with a fantastic design on a piece of paper that you could then look at on a 3D model using CAD, etc. But once that's passed over to, Mr. Smith, who's been the brickie for the last 40 years on a building site, who has no access to all of that that knowledge or that
That's
ability
right.
to interrogate that design, etc. He's going to take probably a two-dimensional drawing, look at that, interpret that drawing the way he thinks it's meant to be built, and he'll build it using his knowledge and his experience to the best of his ability. That may not be what the architects had in mind, or the buildability may not actually be possible. And I think there's lots of architects out there who are very, very good architects, but because they've never built a house from start to finish, I'm not going to say they don't understand the process, but there has to be an appreciation of the builder's views and knowledge on the delivery of that and the professional team that sits alongside that.
I think you're right. I think as someone who's an architect and has developed, I start to understand the stresses and strains the developers are going through, and that's maybe something that the team in here don't understand, because they've never been the ones who signed the PGs to the bank to say, right, I'm going to go guarantor on £4 million worth of development funding,
Yes.
And then when
if it goes horribly wrong, I've got to explain to my family why we're now out off shopping for a tent.
That's it. So I kind of get that whole philosophy. Equally, I think the other hand though is that in my career, I've seen a lot of tradesmen, when you turn up, you get the more experienced tradesmen, and it's kind of thing, listen, son, I've been doing this for 25 years. That's just how I go, aye, but the point is that it's now changed.
Yes.
Not because I'm enforcing it, but because building control statutory policies. So we went through a year or two. I'm not talking about the quality of the design, I'm talking about the construction detailing and why things are put the way they are. It's because policy, building standards, bureau, all that stuff's changed. And we went through maybe a year, 2 year process to get a project on site. And then there's nothing more frustrating for us when the time served brickyard, the joiner says, listen, I'm just going to do it this way because that's the way I've always done it, So there is that ebb and flow. And I think that's one of the big things about this podcast. It's all about trying to expose those differences, those challenges, and get the information out there, because realistically, we can't always fix it on site. We can't always fix it in the boardroom. We probably won't be able to fix it all through a podcast, but it is about getting those big burning challenges and issues out there. Housing, I think, is something I'm passionate about as an individual. I know that you're passionate about it. Really, we want to try and drive in now into the big question. What's the big challenge? What's the big issue for you in the construction industry, or in housing, in your business?
That's a really difficult question to answer, because I guess our industry and housing in the whole of the UK right now is extremely complex. I think the black and white is, the housing crisis that we have is easy to fix from a practical point of view, because there's lots of companies, major businesses, SMEs out there who want to do more and deliver more and grow their businesses and scale and deliver more housing, etc. But when you take the whole process and everything and everyone that's involved in that, it is a very, very difficult or very complex situation to try and fix. So I think the challenges that our industry has is from, I guess, government level. We need a more proactive or a more pro-development approach to housing. Ultimately, everyone, no matter their background, where they come from, what their circumstances are, everyone deserves a safe, secure roof over their head. And that has to be the first priority for any government and any local authority. We live in a modern world. The UK is supposed to be one of the most advanced countries in the world. We have all these wonderful things, yet we have people who still live in temporary accommodation. We've got people sleeping on streets, and we've got people who are living in houses that are, rife with mold and other health issues. Or large families that are living in one bedroom little apartments, which is completely unfit for purpose. And we shouldn't have that in today's day and age. I think if we had a plentiful supply of housing, the we wouldn't have to worry about rent controls because the markets would solve that problem themselves. We wouldn't have to worry about the affordability of buying new houses, because if there was a sufficient number of houses to go around, house prices would settle down, greed would be eliminated, and things would certainly be much better.
Yeah.
And the only way we can solve that is by building more houses. To deliver more houses, we have to look from the bottom up and from the top down. So we need to look at things like the planning system, which the length and the breadth of the country is a problem and a challenge. We need to look at the opposite end of the scale, apprenticeships and training, and getting enough or sufficient numbers of young people involved in construction. And that only comes by introducing them into construction whilst they are maybe still going through the education process at school. And that's probably because over the last 20, 30 years, the indoctrination at school has all been about go through school, get a good education, head off to university, become an architect or a solicitor or a doctor, and all of those. We certainly need all of those skills and those professionals, but we also need tradespeople, and we need everything in the construction industry, from admin staff to people involved in the finance and procurement and design, engineering, as well as joiners and electricians and plumbers and ceramic tilers and decorators, etc. And there is a place for everyone. And I think there has been, I believe, over the past few decades, almost an elitism type system that's come in, where if you're not doing very well at school, then there was this tendency to say, well, you could get a job on a building site as a labourer, and who knows, maybe you'll eventually prove your worth and become a ground worker, or get to retrain and drive one of the diggers, or you're quite good with your hands, but you should maybe think about being a joiner or a plumber, as opposed to someone else who's doing quite well at school saying, well, you don't want to be doing things like that. You want to be focusing on university, and you can become an architect, or you can become a doctor or a brain surgeon or a rocket scientist, etc. But I think that young people should be given the opportunity to choose their own career path. I think there should be much more effort made to let them see that whole broad range. And if we look at it from an earning capacity, it may be that they go into uni, and I didn't do uni, I went straight into construction, but they may go into uni, take on some student loans, have those student debts, then get a job as a trainee doctor, or etc. And by the time they've then gone on, in 10, 15, 20 years' time, if you look at what their earning potential is and the baggage that they were left with from uni, etc., and say, well, what's that averaged out at over those years to get to where they're at, and what kind of future does that hold for them? But then also put that in the same context of, your average plumber. I don't know about when you look outside here, but up our way, the average plumber's turning up in their Ferrari, because they, charge what they like. But the good tradespeople can earn a very, very, very good living, and if they have any kind of business acumen or entrepreneurial spirit inside them, that tradesperson who served the time and became a good quality electrician might then think, well, actually, I'm going to take on a couple of young people and start to train them, because I've got the opportunity of doing much more work because I've created a good reputation. And now they're starting to earn a little bit more because they've created this little micro business. And, with any luck, that takes off and it starts to scale. and before you know it, they're employing 20, 30, 40, 50 people.
Yeah.
So as well as being an electrician, which I'm sure they're extremely proud of, and when people say, what do you do? I'm sure the first answer they give is, I'm an electrician, as opposed to saying, I'm a businessman, or I'm a businesswoman, or I'm an entrepreneur, etc.
Yeah.
They will see themselves as an electrician, and that's what's given them that life that they've created. But they're still, I guess, gambling every day, much as any business owner, on all that's involved in running the business. But I think if we can encourage more young people into the sector, that's certainly one of the big challenges.
Yeah,
and then, of course, everything else in between, planning down to.
It's a huge topic, it really is, and that's why I think this podcast is going to work, because I think when we get all the different guests on, we'll see the breadth of what the challenges are.
Yeah.
I've got my own views, which I'll start sharing over the course of the podcast, about what the biggest challenges are for us as architects in the industry. But you're not the first person to talk to me about, recruitment and bringing new talent through. Construction isn't the only industry in the UK that's struggling from that perspective, but it is a big thing. I've heard a lot of people talking about the challenges of affording apprentices as well, and how that's going to pan out over the next few years. There's the whole thing of immigration. There was I think was it just after COVID, a lot of people, or just before and after COVID, a lot of people went back to their countries, because they didn't want to be in the UK, back home with their families, and that left the construction market with a labour shortage as well. So it's an interesting time for UK construction, not just recruitment, but the education of people who are coming in, and I suppose at any level in the industry, because we've got this whole sustainability thing coming on board. We've got people looking for efficiencies in construction as well, which means we need to train people differently on how to build quicker. We've got the whole environmental policy coming on, not just about sustainable and design, but the whole environmental policy about looking at a piece of ground and how does the developer's team, the architects, everyone, the planners, how do we deal with trying to basically, make an omelette without cracking eggs? That's pretty much what the UK government says is, yeah, you can build your houses, but don't break anything, how do we do that? So it's an interesting one, that education, apprenticeships, etc., are all big challenges that we're going to face. Seeing as you've highlighted that, right, I'm going to put you on the spot here. How or have you started to think about how you're going to implement that in your own business?
Yes. So we have several different hats that we wear on different days. I'm in the position where I am the developer, so the overarching company that owns the development site and has to go out to the banks cap in hand to borrow the money to raise the millions of pounds to do the development. So I'm the developer. I'm the builder, because we then engage and enter into a contract with Inverty Homes as the delivery partner. But we also have, as in Mike and I, from the back of those developments that we were doing, or off the back of those developments, we started to manufacture our own timber frame kits, and that was part of an in-house process of Inverty Homes in the early days. And then in 2020 we separated that out and set up a new company called Timber Engineering UK, and the purpose of Timber Engineering was to evolve, develop and grow as a timber frame manufacturer and offer that product to other developers as well as ourselves. So under the Timber Engineering arm, if you like, of our business, we have started to engage with universities and schools to try and stimulate some interest in the business. And what we have actually on the go right now is we had some second year engineering students from university came along to our business, and as part of their training program, they have to do certain things and solve certain problems, etc. So we were asked if that was something that we would be interested in supporting. So they came along, we gave them a few challenges about different problems that we had, perceived problems on our manufacturing of the timber frames, and set them the challenge of coming up with ways of improving the efficiency of our factory process. And that was everything from materials and trucks delivering at the rear of the factory, ready to be brought in, how that whole time and motion and that process would go through the factory itself, how we could alter or set up or change the factory to make the whole systems and process as we go through that more efficient, making sure that it complied with things like our ISO 9001 for keeping track of where everything is and the quality assurance, etc. And then that product then leaving the factory to head out of onto the building site. And those students come up with a fantastic range of ideas. The university split them into a couple of different teams, and they almost had that as a bit of an in-house competition. And young Ed and Karen went to a presentation I think it was maybe about 2 weeks ago at the university, where each team had to present and some of them went down the semi-automated route with different kinds of machinery, moving components about, etc. And some had went more traditional, where it involved employing some more people in the factory to carry out different elements of that process. But they certainly came up with some quite good ideas. So what we're hoping to do is cherry pick a couple of those pieces and see what's practical to introduce into our business. But hopefully that's given them the ability to move forward on the education that they're doing at university, but also giving them a good insight into what we're doing as a manufacturer and how that links into construction, and perhaps maybe inspire one or two of them to look at construction as a viable option. The second thing that we've been doing, and it's on or is live right now, is we've set up a small timber transformation competition. And the theory behind that was we take a small model making kit and pass that on to some schools and ask them to design their own house, build it into a 3D model, and come back and present it to us as a little competition. And we hoped that we would get maybe 8 or 10 teams involved in this, being the first time we've ever tried it. We've now ended up with, I think we're sitting at 71 teams of schools across the kind of Tayside region who signed up and are actively taking part. It's about 700 plus children that are involved. Right. I mean, we had to go and buy lots more materials, obviously, for the kits, but and that was an interesting day. Was the team was building all the kits and put them into packages and whatnot, and then they all had to be distributed to the schools. So what's going to happen is the schools will run that for X amount of weeks. They are going to do a video presentation of their house that they've created, and it's all about creativity at this point. So they were to design any kind of house that they wanted, build it out of the model making kit that we supplied them. We're hoping that there'll be lots of colours and creativity and unique features. And I mean, we're building your average 3-bedroom semi-detached type house, but we're hoping that we'll get houses with swimming pools and the like. And once, because it's now become so big, is once we have all that initial submission back, we will then narrow that down into finalists of maybe 10 teams, and we'll have a grand final. But in the final, we've now decided that we will ask them then to look at things like sustainable forms of construction, the energy efficiency of the house, how they could maybe create some sort of micro energy generation in the houses. So trying to get them to look at things like solar panels or little mini wind turbines or grey water harvesting, how they would build the house to make it energy efficient and keep the house affordable, etc. So that'll allow us to just take it to the next level and get them, being a bit more in depth on what they're looking at. So that, hopefully, because that's high school students, second year, third year type age, and they're at the age now where they're about to start looking and choosing their subjects for their future career path. So that's why we targeted that age group, because it's the perfect age to hopefully inspire some youngsters to look at construction.
I think you should probably also send that pack up to Dundee University, to their architecture department, and see just how good their first years
See how it
do as
compares
well.
to
See they compare.
the
Yeah,
young students.
that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it'll be good, and when we do the final, the kids are all going to come to our offices, and we have a few other people involved in the judging panel. So it's not just about us on the in-house team. So we've got Matt from Sustainable, Rachel from Build PR, Rob from the Courier, the local newspaper, is coming along. But if we were able to just get a small judging team that's not me, and to choose, and we'll come up with a grand final, and ideally we would like to. We've put a prize in place for the winning team, but I think we should at least come up with some kind of certificate for all the other teams for taking part, because I'm sure there'll be lots of things that are in there that are fantastic on every single design.
Well, I think it's great that you've highlighted a problem in the industry, and as a business, you and Mike have decided you're going to do this so that you can try and fit. I mean, we can't all plug all of the holes because it's such a vast problem, but finding a bit that you can contribute towards and grow awareness, I think it's a fantastic thing. I'll be interested to see if more of our guests come along have actually thought that far ahead. So, with all of that said, and everything that's happening in the construction industry, what is the next 4 or 5 years? What does that look like for Inverte Homes?
I think obviously, like any SME business, particularly in development, we all have a passion for trying to do better, to deliver more. And I think the average SME developer in the UK are of the same ilk as us, where we would quite like to continue to evolve our houses to be as energy efficient and as affordable as they possibly can, whilst giving a fantastic end product. So for Inverte, it was all about creating more space. Our houses are around about 30% larger than the national average. About the efficiency of construction, which then allowed us to sell the house at a genuinely affordable price, so that pound for pound people are getting really good value for money. And fitting that house out with good quality materials, so that the external envelope is up to a really a superior level or U value, which then translates into an exceptional energy efficiency performance that we're getting out of the house. And then things like, for example, the final fit out, we use German quality kitchens, we put in German door sets, which we distribute and import into UK direct from a manufacturer in Germany. And all of those things give us something that we believe is better than our competitors, or better than the big nationals who are kind of stuck in their ways of delivering at scale. But as Inverte, it would be good if we were able to deliver 10 or 15 or 20% more houses than we currently do, and in a year or two's time again deliver 10 or 15%, then we would be doing our small part in helping the housing crisis. And out with that, we have been engaging with government, north and south of the border. We've been, Mike was down at an all-party parliamentary group on development. We've been engaging with all kinds of industry professionals, etc. And what we're trying to do is share our experiences, good and bad, to help the conversation around the wider industry. And ultimately, we as an industry, we need to find ways of increasing output, because we have a system that's not working. We went to an event with one particular council, and it was a round table event of which there was a couple of hundred stakeholders that joined the event itself. And of that, I think there was only 3 of us that were developers. And our opinion was if it's not working, and the rules that are in place, because what we were constantly being told when we were making suggestions, well, unfortunately the rules prohibit us from doing that. Well, the policies prohibit us from doing that. And eventually we said, well, maybe it's time that the people who created the policies, you got them all back round the table and had a vote there and then to tear up the rule book and tear up the policies and start from scratch. Because if the system's broken, it has to be fixed, and the only way to fix it is to unpick the problems. And I think if we can look at things like the amount of changes that happen in the industry, if we could maybe, in Scotland, for example, if we can just all agree on one set of policies. So, for example, if every new build house has to be an A-rated EPC house, how you achieve that is up to every individual developer. House styles will all be different, etc. But if we all just went for one target that is perfectly achievable right now without trying to reinvent the wheel, we could increase output. But once we've set that standard, I think it has to stay at that for the next 10 years. And in 5 years' time, whilst industry is now increased output, then the policymakers and the academics could all get around the table and start to look at what is the next evolution going to be. And maybe by year 8, that could be shared with the wider industry, or year 7, shared with the wider industry for feedback. By year 9, that could be all sort of stamped and ratified, and everyone then knows by year 10, this is now the new standard. But if we benchmark that where each incremental change of the standards meant that the average cost of construction didn't increase by, say, 15%, we would maybe be able to keep control of how house prices evolve in the future as well. Whereas if we go from building houses that we are now and trying to predict what we need to be building in 10 years' time and take that massive leap from step 1 to step 13 in one fell swoop, what's happening is SMEs up and down the country are being decimated and failing at record numbers. The major house builders are becoming more and more powerful, for want of a better way to put it, and the end user, who's the most important in this whole process, are continuing to be left with houses that are not fit for purpose or far too expensive and impossible to afford.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because we work with some small developers, small to medium-sized developers. Some of the things you've said is interesting, in as much as that I know from yourself and Mike that you're pretty well ahead of the game in terms of trying to pioneer efficiencies in your construction methods, but also looking at thermal performances, sustainability, tightness, all that kind of stuff. There are other developers that we work with who just, well, what's the minimum I need to do to pass the building control regulations? So there's that whole dilemma as well within the design process that we come against on a day-to-day process. And then, legislation and bureaucracy and policies, they change so often that we can't keep up with it.
Yeah.
They change so often that your planning officers and building control officers can't keep up with it because they don't get trained on it.
Yes.
It's just, there's the new policy, and it's almost like what happens is the first planning application or building application comes in, and then they sit down and read it against the job, and then there'll be a few things they'll forget about a mistake. So the next time we put an application in, it's all this catch up, So that whole policy making thing does need a radical rethink. There seems to be no collaboration or linking up between the various, SEPA do their thing, Scottish Water do their thing, planners do their thing. And when we try, as probably architects, project managers are even on behalf of the developer, we're front loaded, we're client facing, we're facing all these different statutory authorities. And it's like, can we get a round table meeting, a conversation, a bit of collaboration? Nobody wants to answer the phone. Nobody wants to answer the emails. They just want to do their bit because their policy document says this. And if you don't tick the box, then sorry, you're not getting...
Well, I mean, interestingly, Mike and I have, as you can imagine, opinion on this as well, is if that's how they want to handle planning applications, I'm all for that. But I think what we then need is to look at how the planning system is set up in which to allow them to act that way or run the planning department that way. So, for example, if each local authority took their planning department and used that to create policy, and that might generate let's say 50 different items that this is the policy, this is the wording on the policy, and that should be almost a black and white how everything is achieved. In order to open up the opportunity for more developments to take place, once they've created that policy, it should be you either comply with that or you don't. And if that's the case, why do the planners need to be involved in the planning decisions? Why can't you have an external or a separate department or a private company who oversee the planning applications? That should free up and maybe reduce the pressure on the planning departments. But if they've created the policy and it's a belt and braces, it shall be thus, or it is, and any application that goes in would be, do you comply with policy number 9? Well, actually, yes, that does. Well, that's a tick, and therefore that's a pass. And if you comply with all of those, and that is then recommended or approved, it should be an approval. There shouldn't be this grey area where it then comes down to the opinions of individuals, because unfortunately that's where things, the wheels have come off the wagon, is there's too many people with too many different opinions, and none of it, you'll have different opinions than I do on a whole range of different things. But we have to find a way of greasing the wheels to be able to get it through. And if it comes down to the pressures that council have because of budgets, well, allow them to create the policy, put the policies in place. The developers, their job will be to take that policy, sit down with their professionals and their design team, come up with a system, and once they're sure that that meets that policy, that gets lodged. Within a matter of weeks, that policy is now, that application has been approved because it meets all the terms of the policy, and there's no right of or opportunity to refuse that. The second part that I think, which links into that as well, is every council up and down the UK, not just in Scotland, the whole of the UK, should, in my opinion, have to put in an updated local development plan every 5 years. And once that local development plan's locked in place, that then sets which region's going to be, or which areas for housing, which areas for industrial, etc., etc. Now, 5 years might be ambitious because I don't work in council, so I'm not going to claim that I know how their world works and vice versa. But if they had a scenario where they identified an area of ground and said that is going to be industrial, that is going to be for housing, etc., at that point in time, that's where the public consultation should take place. So they identify an area of land and say, we believe we can get 2,000 houses on that site. During that local development plan rollout, and as that's all been ratified and approved, that is when the notice should go out. Members of the public who are not developers, and they're also not planners. Planners are professionals, just as developers and architects are. But Mr. Smith, who occasionally walks his dog on that piece of land, at that point in time would have the right to then comment on that proposed area for development into houses, or that proposed area for leisure, for retail, etc. But once that's gone through that process and been closed out, and the council then sit down, or the local councillors, and they vote on that, once they've voted and included that and ratified that local development plan to say this piece of land is for housing, there should be no right of objection by the mainstream public. It should then come down to the planners, the planning policy, meeting all those policy criteria, and then delivering those housing units. That should be or I think that would be a good process, because it means that everything could then flow quicker, and developers who have to try and find more and more innovative ways of funding their developments would then be able to have the certainty of saying, well, in effect, there's outline planning. So they're guaranteed that 50 houses could go on that site. We know we can definitely get 50 houses. It now comes down to us coming up with a suitable planning application that accommodates the planning policy for those 50 houses. But we know that the value of that land is based on 50 units. And we also know that someone who used to live in the area 30 years ago, who now lives somewhere else, that played on there as a child and doesn't think that it should be houses on there, doesn't have the opportunity at that point, once money, and it's big money it's being spent, that might.
Yeah, it's interesting because we see that firsthand. Policies, so there is a lot of green policies, there's a lot of planning officers who interpret things differently from each other and from the way that we typically as architects might interpret it. Some might say we're always trying to favour the developer or favour the development. Well, I understand that, but there is a lot of grey areas. And then there's great scenarios recently that wildly promoted in socials, etc., about major house builders who've went in with planning applications on land that's zoned for housing. It's already approved as land zoned for housing, and then getting refusals because local councillors, for example, have said you're not quite making the contributions for the local school because this school's. I mean, that just shouldn't happen.
It's a hidden tax.
It's a hidden tax. At the end of the day, if there's a consent there at local plan that piece of land can take 2,000 houses, it should be able to take 2,000 houses.
Yeah.
It's not this whole thing about the detail of, or the school's not got capacity, or the cemetery's not got capacity, or it's nitty-gritty that should have been thought about and resolved before that local plan came into place.
Absolutely. Developers are not responsible for educating children.
No.
Developers are not responsible for the health of the population of a city, etc. Those things. That's what we all pay our taxes for.
That's right, yeah.
Our children are entitled and have the right to go to school. Our families and our grandparents, and we all have the right to go to a hospital and a doctor and that when we're feeling unwell. But what's happened is the narrative has been twisted, where people still think we live back in the 70s and 80s where Sir Laurie Barrett flew about in his helicopter and developers are all billionaires and we're all disgustingly rich and it's all about greed. And that's absolutely not the case. But if you look at the actual cost of building a house, but the final cost of that housing delivery, the difference is huge. And that's all made up with costs that are added onto someone's mortgage. So, for example, the average person who buys a new build house probably doesn't realise that a huge percentage of their mortgage was to contribute towards the local school, whether they have children or not, or whether their children already go to that school. They're still being taxed that cost to provide that education now. They've contributed towards parks. They're now having to set up factoring. It may be contribution towards GP surgeries. A whole host of it. And there was one in Edinburgh that it was railway upgrade, network upgrades, all sorts of extra costs that are being put on that. Affordable housing contributions. I know of a developer who's, I won't say the area, but was doing a development of half a dozen houses in a nice area of Scotland, and the contribution for affordable housing was £47,000 a unit. Now, the people who bought those houses, I'm pretty sure, would be a little bit upset if they found out that £47,000 of their mortgage over the next 25 years was to pay for social housing that's actually the responsibility of government. And I had a debate with someone once about, but what if a family moved to Inverness, for example, from Glasgow? They're putting extra pressure on the services in Inverness. And I said, well, I get that and I agree with it. Why don't we just make it transparent? Why don't we just say, if you buy a house in Inverness, the house is £250,000 plus £5,000 tax to the local authority for the extra burden you're putting on their services. Just be honest about it and be transparent. Why say that it's a developer contribution? The developer has to add it on to the price of the house, otherwise the houses could never be built because you can't make the numbers work, and that family is paying for that. I said, but likewise, what if they already live in Inverness? What if their kids already go to the school? What if they're already registered with the doctor's surgery and the local dentist, etc.? Why are they having to pay that extra cost, that extra contribution? Because they're not increasing the burden on that local authority. They already have the right of access to all of that.
Sure, yeah.
And they'd said, oh, but it's just if they came from another area, and it has to just be a broad brush approach. I said, okay, well, I agree with that as well. So if they're alleviating the pressure on Glasgow, having taken their family from Glasgow up to Inverness, is there an opportunity to go back and ask for a contribution from the council?
From
Because
Glasgow, yeah.
we'll help alleviate the pressure on your services in Glasgow. We will voluntarily leave your area. And if you've deemed that the extra pressure on your region comes in at £5,000 or £10,000 per family, could we have a £10,000 contribution to us moving out of your area just to assist? And so,
it's interesting you say that, because I remember being at a local event here in South Lanarkshire Council, and we were talking about new schools and developer contributions, but a comment was made, and the figure could be wrong, but I think I'm roughly about right, that even with developer contributions for schools, etc., once that school's up and operational, a typical high school, I think, costs something like 13 million from the taxpayers' purse to run that. So, the reverse was coming from the council, saying it's all right saying maybe the developers in the area in that region have contributed 1 million, but the actual running costs of that for a year is 30 million. And my view is, well, okay, I get that, but again, that's not the developer's problem. You want houses, we'll come in, we'll build your houses, don't make it hard for us, but don't tax us, backhanded taxes. It really does frustrate me, and I've paid them myself. I remember one of the last sites I did was a smaller site, 16 units. We took it from planning permission for 12 to 16. They wanted contributions on the additional 4 to the tune of just over £100,000.
Yeah,
and then you look at the breakdown, you think and some of it was ridiculous, like £25 per house to the local cemetery. I thought, really, is that hard up that you need £25?
Yeah, it reeks of desperation just to get money from anywhere, and because there's this fallacy that developers are wealthy, why don't we just take it from the developers? Because, and I think what's happening now and what will happen, and I'm saying I think, I know, there's many regions now across the UK that the cost of delivering a house is more expensive than the end value of the product. Yeah. Now, there has to be a profit margin. Otherwise, one, as a business, why would you get involved anyway? But two, even if you did want to do it for, social reasons or philanthropy, etc., you still have to get access to the funding. And if you go along to any bank as a developer and say, I would like to build out this site, it has a GDV of £15 million, and my cost of construction, by the time I've paid everything, is 14.9. Can I borrow the money, please? The bank will ask you to leave quite quickly.
Yep.
So, even this break-even scenario doesn't give access to funding. And apparently now there's more than 60 areas across the UK where the cost of construction exceeds the value of the end houses, which means that those local authorities have no chance of encouraging any developer to build in their area. So how do they fix their housing crisis? Because if those are areas where, theoretically, if that's how the balance is working, that they are of lesser value, maybe the average income is less, etc. So, for example, if you compared Dundee to Edinburgh, it may be that Edinburgh is a viable place to build houses, but Dundee isn't. And that might just come down to the fact that the land value is too expensive, the contributions are too high, the cost of delivery is the same, give or take, to build a house in Dundee than it is in Edinburgh. It's the same builders, merchants we buy all the materials from. The cost of labour isn't drastically different. If I go to Yorkshire, for example, we're involved in some sites down there where if I was to take one of the houses that I'm building in Dundee and drop it into a site in Yorkshire, it'd be worth probably £150,000-200,000 more.
Yeah.
But they're paying less down there for brickies than what we're paying in Dundee, because the going rate in Dundee is higher.
Yeah.
So there comes a point where developers, I'm not going to say they are boycotting or will boycott, but it's just they physically cannot develop in those areas. And if you're competing on a region by region basis, because every single region in the UK has a housing challenge and are all competing for the same limited resource, But if Glasgow is looking more attractive to a developer and the numbers could work and it allows their business to be sustainable, then they'll go to Glasgow and no longer build in Fife or Perth or Dundee or Kinross or that's the issue that local authorities now have to think about.
I think the wee thing that just came to my mind there as well is not just new build housing, but also existing stock. Because local authorities are in the same position. You spoke earlier about dampness in houses and upkeep and maintenance. And okay, we do see some big contractors locally who specialise in refurbishment of council stock. But even for the homeowner, I mean, I remember driving through a relatively sleepy village in South Lanarkshire called Carnwath, and I was driving through the main street, and it kind of looked a bit like a ghost town. And the high street was in a bit of disrepair. Probably most of the houses were privately owned. But I'm looking at these houses thinking, that needs a new roof, it needs new windows, it needs new doors. It's a very old construction. It's probably got damp and rot, etc., etc. I thought, how do these homeowners actually afford to upkeep those houses and still retain the value? Because some of these houses, you're probably spending the guts of £60,000, £70,000 on them just to get them, wind, watertight, warm again. And thinking it's Carnwath, it's not going to have that end residual value in it.
Yeah.
So there's a whole thing of how do we as architects support developers? How do we get new houses on the pitch? But then how do we also deal with existing housing stock, and how does government help with that? So the housing, I think this interview has probably exposed quite a lot of areas where housing is a catalyst to fixing a lot of the homeless problems, the quality of our lifestyles, but also probably reigniting the UK economy as well.
Absolutely. You cannot fix all of the other societal issues that we have in the UK around health and well-being, educational attainment, homelessness, all of those things. The foundation of all of that is getting families into a good quality home, or at the very least getting them out of temporary accommodation. We've got record numbers of children now in temporary accommodation in the UK. It's outrageous in the world that we live in right now. We shouldn't have one single child in temporary accommodation in the UK. And yes, I get that there's all kinds of political angles as to why that is, but ultimately, we have, as a nation, the ability to fix this quite easily if we just strip back all of the noise. We cannot have a scenario where local authorities or central government are demanding that we find ways of making housing affordable, but conversely, they're putting up the prices for planned applications, they're charging money for road bonds, they're wanting education contributions, blah, blah, blah. All of those things of what made houses unaffordable. And if we wanted to make houses genuinely affordable, we can do it overnight with the right people in power.
Excellent. Eddie, I could talk about housing in this for hours and hours and hours, and I think there's loads to be spoken about. So thank you for your time today on the podcast. I've thoroughly enjoyed myself. Hopefully you have as well. I've got one last question for you, if you don't mind. And that's, if you don't mind, could you leave a question for our next guest? And I know you don't know who that is, but we're going to try and have a wee bit of fun with the next guest.
All right, okay. If they were to, I'm going to focus mine on housing.
Fair enough.
For obvious reasons. If that guest was to step in the shoes of either the Prime Minister or the First Minister of Scotland tomorrow, what three things would they introduce overnight to resolve the housing crisis?
Excellent. I know who the next guest is, so I'm sure we'll have fun with that one. Eddie, thank you very much for your time and coming along here to the Hard Hat podcast, and we'll see you on LinkedIn.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for tuning in to the Hard Hat Talks. If you enjoyed the conversation, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, whether you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your shows. That way, you'll be sure to never miss an episode. If you've got any feedback or a topic you want us to tackle, please drop us a line. We'd love to hear from you. Till next time, stay safe, stay sharp, and keep your hard hat on.